Well, hello again. Here I am reporting on another book that I finished recently. It's a quick read, took me a few days. Highly recommend, called Digital Liturgies by Samuel James. James, this is a recent book, maybe 3 or 4 years ago that it came out. He explores how our modern digital world is shaping us in different ways, the kinds of practices that we take, how we think about things. Sort of a deep dive and a really thoughtful dive into the impacts of the internet on our broader cultural trends and problems. One of the things that he highlights is the difference between being online versus being in person, the difference between being embodied versus being in a digital space, and how in our physical spaces we have a sense of place, a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, right? Men or women, right? A husband or a father or a mother. There are unique things about us in our physical composition and the physical kinds of relationships that we have. When you go on the internet, though, that's no longer the case. You can create avatars, you can express ideas, you can have pseudonyms, you can sort of share what you want, you can craft a profile, you can craft messages. All of a sudden, in the digital world, it's not so much about embodiment or location, place, purpose, and identity in terms of a given identity, but rather it's about creation, creativity. And really what ends up happening, though, is that creativity tends to be an expression of your will and your desire. And so on the internet, we see people extending and acting very willfully and in pursuit of all kinds of desires, which are often disordered. And so the internet is a different kind of place than the world in which we live. Now, that might sound obvious, okay? We all know that, of course. But James goes a little bit further on a couple dimensions. So one thing he points out is that the problems with the internet extend far deeper than distraction, right? We all sort of acknowledge maybe we're on our phones too much, we're online a little bit more than we should be, it's distracting. And we also, Christians especially, have been aware of bad content on the internet, pornography, other kinds of detrimental material, ways to waste time. And so there's been a lot of focus on the content, and James argues we haven't focused enough on the structures of the internet, the sort of the epistemological nature of how we consume information, and not just how we consume information, but how our methods of thinking and of discovering and of talking with others are profoundly shaped by what we do online, how much time we spend online. So there have been a number of people who've talked over the years about the idea that the medium is the message, or the famous book Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman lamented the rise of TV. And with TV, we move from a word-based society, that is to say where our news and our ideas and our conversations are primarily around texts, newspapers and books, to broadcast, where now our news and our conversation are far more image-based, and our brain processes images differently than the way it processes words. There's different kinds of reasoning functions, there's different kinds of emotional engagement. The whole drive for entertainment is a big part of this shift, and you see that in news broadcasting, especially in the podcast world. Today, the most successful podcasters are often the ones who can entertain us, who are funny, who are dynamic, who speak with different kinds of cadences, who have guests on that are interesting. And so our news and our thinking and our commentary has become very mixed with production quality and entertainment value. And that's just kind of an extension of the visual and audio medium that we use. That's very different than the word-based medium. Now, something that James talks about, he doesn't use this term, this is a term I use, but something I've said for years, is Karl Marx, the founder of communism, famously talked about false consciousness, how the proletariat become kind of indoctrinated and believe things that aren't actually in their best interest. They're sort of persuaded by capitalists and religion to adopt views and ideas and habits that are not actually in their long-run interest. And he calls this sort of a false consciousness. It's consciousness, but it's not really true in this kind of authentic, real interest kind of way. I always thought that was a little bit far-fetched, right? What is this false consciousness? But I tell you what, over the last 10 years, I think people's online personas is the closest thing I've seen to false consciousness. And you get this, you interact with someone online, and then when you interact with them in person, you can really see they speak differently, their tone, what they talk about, how aggressive they are can be very, very different. Some might be very mild-mannered in person, conciliatory, friendly, and online, they're just a flamethrower, right? And I have friends like this who, you correspond via email and you're like, are we even friends? And you hang out and it's the best thing ever. And so you can see this kind of difference, what people care about, what they talk about. They're sort of saying crazy things online that they would almost never say to someone's face or in person. And so you get this kind of bifurcation between our personas online and our personas in person. Now, what drives that? Again, the title of the book, Liturgies, I think helps us understand that when you are in certain settings, you can learn how to behave differently. So how you behave at church might be a little bit different than how you behave at home, right? How you engage with a colleague might be a little bit different than how you engage with an old friend. And so, of course, how you engage on Facebook is going to be different than how you engage in a conversation at the coffee shop. And so there are liturgies. These are spaces, digital spaces, with certain kinds of rhythms, routines, practices, habits that we form over time, mostly unconsciously, sometimes consciously. And that's how we enter into the internet, whether it's to find news and read about what's going on, to comment on stories, to just sort of browse. And all of a sudden, our habits, our liturgies begin to kick in. And that's why we behave or can behave so differently in online spaces than we do in real spaces. Now, there's more to what he's talking about here. So there's this false consciousness idea. Another element of the internet, and he sort of talks about this very briefly, but it's something that the psychologist Jonathan Haidt has written about extensively with Anxious Generation and the Coddling of the American Mind and a few other books, is the way in which we engage with online spaces is not sort of neutral or primarily driven by us. It's actually driven primarily by algorithms and choice architecture that's structured in very intentional kinds of ways. So there have been whistleblowers in Silicon Valley who've talked about how social media companies in particular design their platforms to give variable rewards. So what does that mean? It means that when you go on, you may or may not find something that is exciting, that gives you a dopamine hit. And, you think back to the early days of email, right? Part of the idea of jumping on email, think about the movie You've Got Mail, is am I going to get an email or am I not going to have a new email, right? You jump on and there's uncertainty. And so you could have a new email, which would be exciting, but you might not. And so you're drawn to checking your email. This is like checking your phone. Do I have a new notification? Do I have an update? Is something interesting happening? And it's the variable nature where it's not clear that every time you check your phone, something new and interesting and important has happened. But sometimes it happens. And this variable reward is key to driving time online, on screens, drawing people into the platforms. And it shares the basic structures with gambling. Part of what is exciting about gambling or about betting and, speculation in the stock market is, well, what's going to happen today? Is it going to go up? Is it going to go down? Am I going to make money? Am I not going to make money? There's a possibility for something good, but it might not be good. And that variability with this sort of regular reward drives behavior. And this is where the platforms are very good, where they want to make sure you get just enough reward that you don't check out and be like, well, I'm not likely to have another email. I'm not likely to have an update. If you don't get enough reward, then you're not going to come back as often. But if you get rewards too frequently, you don't have that variable anticipation and excitement. So anyway, Jonathan Haidt talks about this. James talks about it a little bit, but it's part of the digital spaces that we inhabit, particularly social media, but other platforms as well. And it really can affect where our attention is drawn to, how we come back to it. It's tied to issues of addiction, something to be thoughtful about for us, and especially for our children and how they engage in online spaces. So I mentioned before, James argues that the web has this epistemological nature, right? And he gives this great example that I really like, where he says, imagine imagine you're kind of on the fence when it comes to abortion. You're not pro or anti. And you read an article that's sort of pro-abortion or more anti-pro-life. And you're reading through it. You read the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, the author says, and pro-life people have been linked to violent attacks on abortion clinics. And you're like, well, that sounds interesting. And there's a hyperlink there. So you click on it, and it takes you to this page about someone who bombed an abortion clinic. And so you start reading that article for a paragraph or two, and the article says, this person was part of this church, and they have a hyperlink to the church, and you're like, oh, what kind of church is that? And you link to the church, and then maybe the church has some kind of connection to a denomination. And what's happened potentially in this situation is you haven't read any of the articles all the way through, but what you have done is you've jumped from place to place following the hyperlinks, and you formed these vague associations, right? Where now you kind of associate, well, yeah, pro-lifers are kind of violent and dangerous, and this person is a Christian, and they're associated with this church, and like Christians are kind of, extreme and maybe dangerous. But you don't actually dig into, is there mental health problems here? Did the church, how involved was this guy in his church? Did the church condemn it? Like, there are all these questions and things that we would normally want to know if we were reading carefully and sitting down with something. But because of the nature of clicking through things, right, sort of following the thread of ideas or of new information, gives us the impression that we're learning something, when in fact we might be forming relatively naive or even false associations and views of the world. The whole idea of clickbait, right, of the headline culture is a part of this. We are caught up in headlines that we like or that support our views, and then we read maybe a few sentences and say, okay, this is great, I need to share this, I know somebody who ought to read this. And so we move to this sort of superficial way of navigating information, right, where we browse, literally browse, in the browser through information. We scan, we scroll, we jump around. And what James argues is that these practices and habits become ingrained in us and can actually make it harder for us to sit down with a book for an hour without checking our phones, or to actually read a 5,000-word essay without jumping around on our computer or elsewhere. And so he says there are these liturgies that we form by being in digital spaces. So I'm just going to run through very briefly some of the liturgies or the functions that he sees that I think are worth thinking about. So first liturgy is authenticity. Authenticity becomes this important idea online, and it's kind of caught in the tagline, my story, my truth, right? Where what's true for me, this is what I experienced, this is, what I'm expressing, and, you shouldn't criticize that or deny it or question it, because then you're questioning me. This is kind of tied up in issues of identity and transgenderism for part of it. But he argues that this drive for authenticity in a fundamentally disembodied space is going to lead to two things. It's going to lead to confusion, right? Where we become confused about our online identity versus our real identity and what's true about us. So he argues it's no coincidence that we've had this big rise in people who think that they're in the wrong bodies. How is that possible? Well, when you disassociate, or when you have different worlds that you participate in, and in one world you can sort of express your feelings and emotions and be part of this kind of culture, online culture that's telling you all kinds of things, and then you come back out of that and you're in this body that doesn't seem to match or fit how you feel or what you want to express online, it creates cognitive dissonance. And you begin to wonder what's wrong. And unfortunately, many people have turned and said, there's something wrong with my physicality, my physical body. Online is who I really am. And those are my real friends. And that's my real community. And physically, this is just an accident, what I'm tied to, what I'm stuck with. And you can see again how this really opens the door for transgenderism and gender confusion more broadly. So confusion is a natural kind of outflow of this quest for authenticity that's in one space but is not embodied. The second element is exhaustion, right? Because you have to keep up appearances, right? We all talk about, and there's lots of media, movies and so forth that criticize people for trying to keep up appearances and how superficial that is. We do that all the time online, keeping up appearances, opinions, relationships, and it can be exhausting, and you're always checking. This is particularly bad for younger folks on social media a lot, without a lot of sort of in-person friends. It becomes very important to be in the know, to follow what's going on, to be part of the conversation. And that just sort of drives part of this epidemic of anxiety that we see, especially among young people, but even those who are older, 20s, 30s, 40s. You see rises in anxieties. People feel like they're missing out, or they're not doing what they're supposed to, or they're not being successful in these online spaces. So authenticity, one of these digital liturgies. A second one is outrage. Outrage, and what he calls, with the tagline, the abolition of thought, where part of the liturgies that we learn online is voicing outrage is good and appropriate and might even get you clicks, followers, likes, whatever it is you're looking for. And so you see it never fails to astonish me, the kinds of piling on that people do about things that they have no connection to. I mean, you could think about all kinds of examples here. The two folks who were caught on the webcam who weren't married to each other, embarrassing, and they shouldn't have done that. But their lives have been made awful by all of this commentary. Thousands, tens of thousands of people commenting and harassing and pursuing them online with their opinion about what they should and shouldn't have done. It's remarkable. And so the mob culture online and the vitriol that we see online, again, tied to the false consciousness I talked about earlier, is driven by these sorts of liturgies of this is what other people are doing, this is what I do. There's something that feels good about it, right? I really told that person or expressed my opinion, and I hope they can take it. Or even if they can't take it, it's good for them. Outrage. Outrage culture is fueled by the internet. Again, that might not be crazy, but it's worth thinking through why. Why is outrage fueled? And it has to do with our liturgies that we get used to and the way in which we don't think through things clearly, but instead we emote. That is to say, we express our emotions as opposed to our thoughts in online spaces. A related concept is the idea of shame and shaming people. So tied into the bullying and the mobs, our culture, and this is, I think, actually one of the more profound points of the book, and he draws on an essay by a friend of mine that's really good. Bill McClay is his name. He's a historian at Hillsdale College, wonderful guy. But Bill McClay wrote this essay called The Strange Persistence of Guilt. And James really kind of makes that the core of this chapter. And he says, our society, our culture can't deal with sin because as we've moved away from Christianity and beliefs in God and the Bible, there's no form of atonement. And so the secular way of dealing with guilt, right, either to sort of go through therapy, to say maybe you shouldn't be guilty at all, to try to push it under the rug, is utterly deficient in dealing with the deep cultural guilt that we feel. And so what we do instead, because culturally many people have all kinds of guilt that they're living with, we project it on others. And so this is the idea of gaslighting, the idea that you basically accuse other people and go after other people and claim that they have done things that actually you have done, right? It's this kind of scapegoating idea we see all the way back in the Old Testament about putting the sins on the goat, saying it outside the camp. There's elements of mimetic desire. Rene Girard is this philosopher that a lot of folks in Silicon Valley really like, about how we imitate and mirror each other's emotions. And he also wrote about the importance of scapegoats and sort of trying to atone for guilt individually and communally. But I want to read a piece of McClay's essay because it's just so good. And so I'm going to read part of what he says here, talking about guilt. So this is Bill McClay, historian at Hillsdale College. The presence of vast amounts of unacknowledged sin in a culture full to the brim with its own hubristic sense of world-conquering power and agency, but lacking any effectual means of achieving redemption for all the unacknowledged sin that accompanies such power. This is surely a moral crisis in the making, a kind of moral transactional analog to the debt crisis that threatens the world's fiscal and monetary health. The rituals of scapegoating, of public humiliation and shaming, of multiplying morally impermissible utterances and sentiments and punishing them with disproportionate severity are visibly on the increase in our public life. They are not merely signs of intolerance or incivility, but of a deeper moral disorder, an Unbehagen that cannot be willed away by the psychoanalytic trick of pretending that it does not exist. Super profound, I think. Hopefully you do too. Bill McClay on that essay, The Strange Persistence of Guilt. Two more things, and then I'll wrap up this review here of James's book. Two more things, or really three, that he talks about in terms of liturgies of online culture. One is our focus on consumption, finding things, consuming things, articles, posts, information. Is this really consumption-oriented approach to the world where we can find and get just about anything we want online very quickly? Exposure, how we are exposed, or we expose ourselves in certain ways when we're online a lot, reputationally, morally, to criticism, perhaps even physically if there's doxing that goes on. And so there's a certain amount of exposure that comes through being in the online world that can be dangerous and humiliating. What goes on the internet lives forever, right? Which is really remarkable in many ways. It's you can never live it down in some ways, or it never goes away. That's a big deal. And it means that we should be thoughtful, obviously, about what we put on the internet. But so many people, because the internet is such a part of their daily life, they just sort of, it's like what they eat and drink and breathe. And so you can't be careful 100% of the time, every moment of every day. Or if you are being careful, it goes back to this sort of exhaustion, the point that he points out earlier. Imagine being careful about what you say or post or do 24/7, right? The term walking on eggshells, right? We've all had that experience around, difficult people and so forth. Unpleasant, hard. Imagine living that life online, and it becomes oppressive, or can become oppressive if you're doing it a lot. So exposure. And then at the end of the day, again, this kind of cultural problem that didn't arise with the internet, but I think the internet has made worse, is meaninglessness, right? Trivia, the rise of minutia, where we spend our time on things that lack any real substance. We scroll and we spend our time, and there's nothing substantive there. And this ties into kind of culturally, as people have moved away from Christianity, this sense of meaninglessness, right? Triviality, banality, right? Things not being important, things not mattering, right? It's like what Shakespeare said in Hamlet, right? That in this world, life is like a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It's not a great world to live in. And so James, again, in this book, it's a delightful book. I recommend it. It won't take you too long to read. Just spend some good time meditating, reflecting, thinking through how does the internet and the digital world shape how we interact with people, how we think, how we see ourselves. And he hasn't even talked about AI, which is a whole nother question, and I'm not going to get into that now. But that's the next level. What does it mean to live in a world with AI agents, AI responses, chatbots, being able to do things for us, being able to communicate and reflect our thoughts back to us, right? The internet, you're going out and finding lots of things, and you get a little bit of feedback in certain communities or social media. But AI, you get direct feedback. It reflects, it mirrors what you're doing, what you're thinking about. And it has biases towards thinking you're, smarter and on to things that maybe you're not. What does this mean in terms of, Internet 2.0 or Internet on steroids? Well, you have to come back for another episode sometime where I talk about that. So thanks for tuning in. And I recommend Digital Liturgies, Samuel James. Go pick it up. Talk to you later.